All right, thank you, Stephanie. Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Craig, and I serve as the assessment specialist for special populations at OSSE, and I want to welcome you all to this year's PARCC and DC Science Testing Accommodations and Accessibilities webinar. We're really great to have you here this morning, and we're really excited to have you here this morning and spend some time talking about accommodations and accessibility features for this year's assessment. Just a few quick reminders to please mute yourself and turn off your video just to save bandwidth. There are a good number of participants this morning, so we want to make sure that everyone has access to the slides. Also, there's a sign-in sheet that is in the chat, so feel free to sign in throughout the presentation, and definitely before you leave, make sure you sign in. Also, if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to enter them into the chat. Periodically throughout the webinar, we will stop to answer any pertinent questions for the group. So again, remember, just please remember to mute yourself and turn off your video just to save bandwidth.
Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, so today we are going to spend some time, we'll do a quick warm-up activity. We'll discuss accommodations versus accessibility features. We will how to utilize accommodations in the classroom, PARCC and DC Science accommodations and resources, identifying accommodations for individual students, and dissecting specific accommodations that are on the DC Science, PARCC and DC Science assessment. All right, so let's jump into PARCC and DC Science accommodations and accessibility features. So for a quick warm-up activity, I'd like everyone to take a moment and sort the following list into accommodations or accessibility features. So on your screen, you have a few items. So notepad, large print edition, individual testing, eliminate answer choice, highlight tool, human reader, human signer. So if you could just take a moment to mentally sort, or if you want to write them down, but you don't have to report out, but I just want you to spend a quick second sorting each into a group of accommodations versus accessibility features. All right, hopefully that was enough wait time. All right, so how did everyone do? We have on the left, our accessibility features are broken into eliminate answer choice, highlight tool, and notepad. And our accommodations on the right are human reader, human signer, large print edition, and individual testing. All right, so how do you distinguish between an accessibility feature and an accommodation? According to the PARCC and DC Science Accessibility Features and Accommodations Manual, the 7th edition, accessibility features are tools or preferences that are either built into the assessment system or provided externally by the test administrators. Accessibility features can be used by any student taking PARCC or DC Science assessments. Accommodations, on the other hand, are considered to be adjustments to the testing conditions, test format, or test administration that provides equitable access during assessments for students with disabilities and students who are English learners. So the key distinction between both of these is that accommodations are equitable, they're providing equitable access, and that's a key term that you need to remember that we will be highlighting throughout the presentation. And students with disabilities are legally entitled to accommodations, which should be reflected in the student's IEP. For the 2021-22 school year, the following assessments will be administered in the District of Columbia. I won't read the entire thing, but I'll just highlight the assessments that we are offering. So we have our PARCC, ELA, literacy assessments, our PARCC math assessments, our DC science assessment, dynamic learning maps, science assessment, which is our alternate assessment for science, our multi-state alternate assessment, which is our alternate assessment for ELA and mathematics, and our WIDA Access for L assessment and the alternate WIDA Access assessment. And this slide also highlights their standards alignment as well as the grades that they are assessed, each students are assessed in. This is a chart that you all should be familiar with. It is also on our OSSE website if you just want to take an additional moment to look at it. Here's another visual of our testing schedule for this school year. We've been highlighting this throughout the year, but just another reminder that our first assessment coming up is our NAEP assessment, which will begin on January 24th, followed by our Access assessment, which will begin on February 14th. MSAA and DLM will begin on March 14th, and then our PARCC and DC Science assessment begins on April 4th. So each year, OSSE releases the statewide assessments, participation, and policy performance document. This document has been released for the 2021-22 school year and is posted on the OSSE website. Within this document, there are critical information regarding required assessments, participation universe, and special considerations. Also, there's information about timing and scheduling for this year's assessment, especially with PARCC and DC Science in your testing windows. We acknowledge that schools may have unique scheduling challenges in the light of health and safety plans for this spring. So it is recommended that schools shorten your school's testing window to be efficient as possible to ensure that all students are assessed. So make sure that all testing coordinators and LEAs are familiar with your participation policy document. It is located on the OSSE website. Additionally, another key resource that is released and that has been released for this year is a PARCC DC Science accessibilities, features, and accommodations manual. This manual has been updated to the 7th edition. Within this manual, you will find all accessibility features and accommodations available on PARCC and DC Science assessment. There's qualifying criteria for each feature and guidance on how to administer each feature and or accommodation. So this document can be found on the My Pearson support site for DC. So this is also a key resource that you will utilize throughout your test administration when identifying accommodations for students with disabilities. Each year, OSSE releases the testing accommodations guides, also known as the tags, for test coordinators and test administrators to review. These documents provide an overview of accommodations and accessibility features available in assessment in DC, and they will pretty much be your go-to resource for support with accommodations and accessibility features. You can find these on the OSSE website as well. When you dive into these resources, you will see a crosswalk between all accommodations that are listed in SEDS and how they align to the assessments that are administered in the District of Columbia. But say, specifically, we'll be talking about PARCC and DC Science assessments. So we will dive into these tags in a few slides later, but definitely make sure that you have accessed these accommodations guides from the OSSE website. They will be your go-to tool and resource when identifying accommodations for students. These accommodation guides are broken into 3 sections. You have your first guide is for students with disabilities. Your second guide is for English learners. And then your third guide is your accessibility features and administrative considerations for all students. So again, they're great resources to utilize. PARCC and DC Science uses a framework known as the accessibility system to identify accommodations and accessibility features on the statewide assessments. So we have our outermost shell, which is our accessibility features. These are available to all students and they're built into the system. Several accessibility features are built into the system and all students can access them at any time during the assessment. Our inner shell is our accessibility features that are selected in advance for students. So they are additional features that any students can use, but must be selected during registration. So they must be identified in the SRPNP in order for students to utilize them. And then our smaller circle is our accommodations. And our accommodations are available for students with disabilities and English learners. So again, accommodations must be documented in the student's IEP, 504 plan, or EL plan. And our accommodations are available to students with disabilities and English learners with disabilities. Again, so within the accessibility feature system, the accessibility system, here are some examples of our accessibility features and accommodations. So accessibility features that are available to all students include items such as pop-up glossary, external spell check, line reader tool, repetition of directions. Remember, these are built into the testing platform. Some of our accessibility features that must be identified in advance and turned on are text-to-speech for math, color contrast, frequent breaks, and small group testing. And our accommodations for students with IEPs and 504 plans include text-to-speech for ELA, human signer, calculation device, screen reader, and some of our accommodations for our English learners, our word-to-word dictionary, and translation of math to Spanish. So these are just some examples that you will find in the AF&A manual, as well as the testing accommodations guide when you are identifying which accommodations are best for your students. So I touched on this a little earlier, but accommodations are available to 4 distinct groups of students. You have your students with the IEPs, students with 504 plans, students who are English learners, and English learners with disabilities who have an IEP 504 or 504 plan, excuse me. It's important to remember that with these students, all accommodations must be documented in the student's IEPs, 504 plan, or EL plan in order for them to receive the accommodation on statewide assessments. All right, so this is actually one of my favorite illustrations of equality versus equity, as well as accommodations. So on our left side, we have a father and 2 sons trying to watch their baseball game, and they're all standing on the same size crate, which is equality. But we see that the youngest son is unable to view the game. On the right side, now the father has given the youngest son his crate, so he's standing on 2 crates, so he can now see the baseball game, which is equity. And that's what we want to do for our students with disabilities. We want to level the playing field and give them access and the ability to perform and to access the curriculum and to perform and do their best on our statewide assessments as well as our classroom assessments. So this is just a quick, easy illustration of how equality versus equity work. And as I mentioned before, it is equitable services. We want to make sure that our students with disabilities are receiving equitable services. All right, so our next section, we're going to spend some time talking about classroom versus statewide assessment accommodations. But before we do that, we'll stop to take a moment to see if there are any questions in the chat that need to be answered at this time. Stephanie, are there any questions?
No questions at this time, but if anyone has a question, feel free also to come off mute and ask.
Great. All right, so classroom versus statewide assessment accommodations. Accommodations should never reduce learning expectations by reducing the scope, complexity, or rigor of the classroom assessment. Accommodations should be consistent with those provided in classroom instruction as well as classroom assessments. They should provide equitable access again during instruction and assessments. Accommodations should mitigate the effects of students' disability. They should not reduce the performance expectation, and they should not change the construct what is being assessed. So again, classroom accommodations are designed to remove barriers within the classroom to make sure that students have equitable access during instruction and assessments. When assigning accommodations, the IEP teams should discuss which accessibility feature or accommodations might assist during daily classroom instruction, determine which accessibility features and accommodations to try out with the students during instruction, document and evaluate the effectiveness of the accessibility feature and or accommodation, adjust the student's use during instruction, and determine which accessibility feature and accommodations to use during PARCC DC Science assessment based on classroom results. So something to really remember about this is that when the IEP team meets, IEP team 504 EO team meets to discuss a student's accommodations, they should allow the students to try out what accommodations are working best for them. And it's also important to get students' feedback and input because they are the ones that are using the accommodations. So if a student is using an accommodation in the classroom for 30 days and the teachers are monitoring, the IEP team is monitoring those accommodations, and they find out that accommodations are not working for the student, that the IEP team should reconvene, hold a 30-day review meeting, and talk about what additional accommodations they can use for the student and what will help the student be most successful during classroom instruction as well as on classroom-based assignments and assessments. And it's also remember to document the effectiveness of each accessibility feature and accommodation. So how are they working? Make sure that they are tracking and determining what accommodation is working best for the student and how they are using that during instruction. Statewide assessment, accessibility features and accommodations should not be assigned broadly to all students with the same disability. Again, so the IEP teams, 504 and EL teams should discuss accessibility features and accommodations separately for each content area. Select accessibility features and accommodations that increase a student's access to the assessment and removes barriers. Obtain student input when selecting these accommodations, and avoid using the kitchen sink method to provide students with unnecessary mutual contradictory accommodations. So again, when you're assigning accommodations for statewide assessments, you do not want to assign the same accommodations broadly for students with similar disabilities or the same disabilities. So all students with a specific learning disability should not just automatically be assigned extended time or the use of a calculator. You need to make sure that you're identifying what tools are going to be needed and what accommodations will best support the student's need in order for them to be successful on the statewide assessment as well as the classroom-based assessment. Also, this kitchen sink method, we've all gone to IEP meetings where we see a student's IEP and they just have a laundry list of accommodations that the IEP team decided to put onto the IEP, and the students are not even using these accommodations. This is known as the kitchen sink. So we don't want to do that. We don't just want to just assign random accommodation just because they look good or because we think that the student will use them and will help the student be successful in the classroom as well as statewide assessments. You need to make sure that the students are providing input, utilizing those, testing those accommodations out. If not, reconvene, hold another meeting, and identify more accommodations that will help the student be successful. All right, our next section, we're going to talk about PARCC and DC Science accommodations resources. All right, so to best support LEAs with identifying accommodations, OSSE has enhanced some of the resources that we provide annually. So like we discussed earlier, our testing accommodations guides for this year have been enhanced to help with identifying accommodations when completing the SRPNP. So the OSSE testing accommodations guides have been updated to include references to the SRPNP field definitions guide that are linked here. So you can find these guides on the OSSE website. Within the tags, you will now see the SRPNP field definitions guide reference code, and they are all aligned to the SRPNP. The SRPNP template and field definition guide has been posted to PAN and was also sent out in the NGA bulletin. And like I said earlier, the 7th edition of the manual is available on the MyDC Pearson support page. So this is where you'll be able to find how to link the SRPNP and the SEDS accommodations. Each numbered SEDS testing accommodation guide is referenced in the tags reference column of the SRPNP field definition guide. So on the left, we have our image of the SEDS testing accommodations. All of our accommodations have now been numbered. So you'll see 01 is specialized equipment, furniture, 02 noise buffer, and 03 preferential seating. This now aligns to our OSSE testing accommodations guide reference column in the SRPNP. So you will see that 01 specialized equipment or furniture now aligns to row BD, which is specialized equipment or furniture in the SRPNP. So this is just a way for our testing coordinators and test administrators to align the SEDS accommodations to the SRPNP. Here's a closer look. An example of this is our accommodation 04, location with minimal distractions. The SRPNP field definition guide reference is BB. And as you can see in the SRPNP, it aligns to that specific column. So we've received your feedback and try to make it simpler and more clear to help our test coordinators when assigning accommodations and using the tags and the SRPNP. The 7th edition of our AF&A manual has been released by Pearson and is now available to our LEAs. There have been some updates from the 6th edition to the 7th edition, which include information about DC Science, specifying accommodations is available for PARCC and DC Science or both. So identifying and distinguishing between what accommodations are available on each assessment. There are updated links to external resources. There are updated audio guidelines to reflect the ability to adjust the volume. There is guidance on transcription for Braille and large print. And there's also information about using co-writer and reader extension. So all this is highlighted in the new AF&A manual and their specific tables. So definitely take a look at that when you are working on accommodations in the SRPNP. All right, so before we jump into our next section, we will stop and see if there are any questions in the chat.
Not seeing any questions at the moment.
All right. So identifying accommodations for individual students. When selecting accessibility features and accommodations, the IEP team is responsible for selecting those for students with disabilities. They should follow, so these are some steps that they should follow. So they need to identify which accessibility feature or accommodation might support the student during daily instruction, try out the accessibility feature or accommodation with the student during instruction in that content area, evaluate the effectiveness of the feature of the accommodation, and determine which should be used on PARCC or DC Science. So we really want to drive home the point of trying out these accommodations with students. On statewide assessments, an accommodation should not be the first time a student sees it on a statewide assessment. They should have been using these accommodations during the classroom instruction as well as on classroom assessment, and should be well versed and familiar with them. You should also allow your students to practice using the practice test and those accessibility features that are already built into the system, just to make sure that they are going to be successful and they already have experience using them on the PARCC and DC Science assessment. And it's also just important to remember to evaluate the effectiveness. Make sure that you're documenting when you meet with your IEP team or how successful the student was with the accommodation, to determine if that accessibility feature and accommodation should continue to be used, or you need to find other alternative options for the student. The IEP team should take into consideration this process when selecting accommodations. So PARCC and DC Science, they utilize the decision-making process. This takes in consideration for students with assessment accommodations for students with disabilities, English learners, and ELs with disabilities. So some things that IEP team should think about, some of the factors are the student characteristics, individual test characteristics, and assessment, accommodation, and policy. So some of the characteristics of the student. So what are the student's specific characteristics based on the student's disability and needs? What accommodations does the student regularly use in the classroom and on classroom assessments? And how has the student indicated preference in using these accommodations? What input have the teachers or parents or guardians given as well? When you think about the student's characteristics, you also have to look into the characteristics of the individual test. So what is being asked, and what tasks are being asked of the student, and what they're being asked to measure. And while doing so, will you maintain validity of the assessment? With you looking at the accommodations, you have to identify, are they already being used? And that just goes back to the point of making sure that it's not the first time an accommodation is being used on a statewide assessment. They should be already using these in classroom and classroom instruction. And is the accommodation allowed for that specific portion of the test, and is noted not to remove any barriers? And finally, when you're looking at the preference in the accommodation, are these accommodations made available to the student classroom that are not currently available on the statewide assessment? And are there consequences for using these specific accommodations? So there may be unique accommodations that a student might require that are on the student's IEP, but not specifically on the PARCC and DC Science list. So you need to make sure that there are no consequences for using those specific assessments, those accommodations. When you're looking at the characteristics of a student, you need to look at how to access the student's needs that will impact the selection of the accessibility features and accommodations. Again, accommodations, accessibility features should always remove barriers to learning. So it progresses from students' characteristics to meeting their needs, to identifying an accommodation, to making sure that it is a valid measure of what the student knows and can do. An example of this would be a student with a visual impairment. So does the student require Braille or large print? So when you look at the student with a visual impairment, you look at their specific characteristics and their needs, and then you identify the accommodation. So that specifically, what would support the student more and what will meet their needs? Braille or large print? And is it going to measure what the student knows and can do on the assessment? When you look at individual test characteristics, it is important for IEP teams to understand what tasks are required on PARCC and DC Science assessments in order for the student to be successful. The IEP team should examine the task the students are being asked to do in the assessment, the characteristics of the assessment tasks and classroom assessments and their similarities, assessment accessibility features and accommodations of similarities, and existing barrier removal by using accessibility features. This can be done by utilizing sample items on the My Pearson site. So like I touched on earlier, make sure that you are working with your students to allow them to use sample items and making sure that they are familiar with the accessibility features and or accommodations in the sample items and how to use them prior to taking the PARCC in DC Science. IEP teams, when they meet to determine the accommodations, there are some guiding questions for accessibility features and accommodation selection. So what are the students' learning strengths, challenges, and those needs based on the language needs or disability or both? Which accessibility feature and or accommodations are regularly used by the student during instruction and assessment? What difficulties did the student experience using the accessibility feature and or accommodation? Should an existing accessibility feature and or accommodation be implemented differently? And what specialized instruction is required by the student to achieve grade level or course content Common Core standards? So I like these questions because they guide the conversation and they ground the conversation when identifying accommodations, and they will reduce the kitchen sink method and actually help the IEB team figure out what is best for the students. Again, it's key to document the effectiveness of those accommodations that are being used. And it's so important to reevaluate and hold those 30-day review meetings to make sure that the student is being successful with the accommodation. Getting input from the student and asking what difficulties or challenges they were experiencing with these accommodations and making sure that they have access to them prior to utilizing them on statewide assessments. All right, so now we're going to spend a little time dissecting specific statewide assessments, accommodations. These are some frequently used accommodations that we see, and we just want to spend a little time talking about what they look like and their purpose. So read aloud for ELA literacy is what is listed in SEDS. This aligns to text-to-speech, ASL video, human reader, human signer on PARCC ELA. Students use the human reader, human signer, text-to-speech function to hear test questions and passages read aloud for ELA literacy assessments. This accommodation is intended for a very small group of students with print-related disabilities who are unable to participate in the assessment. Students with disability must severely limit or prevent their ability to access printed text, and it is not intended for someone reading moderately below grade level. And there must be observable repeated attempts to teach the student how to decode printed text. So again, read aloud is intended for a very small group of students who are unable to read, unable to decode, and the IEP team has documented evidence of this. Again, it should not be for students that are reading 1 to 2 grade levels below their same age peers. They should have a disability that severely limits or prevents their ability to access printed text. So that is key when you are assigning this accommodation. Is the student unable to access printed text? Calculation device for non-calculator sections. This aligns to the calculation device and mathematics tool on non-calculator section. This provides access for students with a disability that severely limits or prevents their ability from performing basic calculations. Is the student unable to perform single-digit subtraction, multiplication, or division? Is the student's inability to perform math calculations documented any evaluation summaries from locally administered diagnostic assessments, and is the student receiving ongoing intensive instruction and/or interventions to learn calculations without using a calculation device. So again, similar to the accommodation just mentioned prior, the read aloud accommodation, the student using a calculator on non-calculator section, they must have a disability that severely limits or prevents their ability from performing basic math calculations. They're unable to perform single digit, subtraction, multiplication. And so this also needs to be documented in their IEP, that the teachers, IEP teams have tried interventions to teach the student how to perform basic calculations, but they are unable to do so. So again, they must have a disability that severely limits or prevents them from performing basic calculation. Text-to-speech for mathematics. This aligns to human reader, human signer accessibility features for math. Student uses a human reader, human signer, text-to-speech function, or audio file to hear the test question. Students should be grouped together when taking this same test form. Human reader for human math accessibility feature is an accessibility feature, and you can find out more about this in the appendix in the AF&A manual. But it's important to remember with this one that students should be grouped together when utilizing this accommodation. And lastly, we have unique accommodations. So I touched on this earlier, but their unique accommodations are accommodations that are listed in the student's IEP that they may require to perform in the classroom or classroom assessment or on statewide assessment. They're unique non-standard accommodation that's not listed in the IEP and does not change the construct being measured by the test. Students should, the request should be completed and submitted to OSSE 4 weeks prior to the school testing. You can find them, here's the link, but you can also find the unique accommodation test form on the OSSE website, and you will submit these through the OSSE support tool. Unique accommodations are intended to support the student's ability to perform on statewide assessments. So in some examples that I've seen with unique accommodation, like a student may require to hold a stuffed animal, or a student may require to listen to classical music, or a student may require to test on the floor in the hallway. So these would be some examples of the unique accommodations that are not listed in the testing accommodation guide or the AF&A manual, and your IEP team has concerns or questions about them prior to statewide assessment. So just make sure that you fill out these unique accommodation request forms and submit them to OSSE via the OSSE support tool 4 weeks prior to the school testing date. All right, so we have now come to the end of our presentation. We'll stop to see if there are any questions in the chat, or if you have any questions about anything that we've discussed today, feel free to come off mute, and I will see if I can address them.
Hey, Mike, there have been a few questions in the chat about, sorry, I'm getting an echo, where to access documentation, and including like the tags and the AF&A manual. And so we've been posting links in the chat to where folks can find those resources.
Okay.
And there was also a question about if the PowerPoint from this presentation is posted or when it will be available. And it is not yet posted, but the presentation and this recording will be posted to the OSSE website within the next couple of days.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. So again, all the links can be found in the presentation as well, but everything in the chat and the OSSE website is a great resource for you to find the tags as well as the links to the AF&A manual. All right, so if there are no additional questions, I want to thank you all for participating in this year's Accessibility Features and Accommodations webinar for PARCC and DC Science. If If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me directly at michael.craig@dc.gov, or you can reach out to our OSSE assessments page at osse.assessment@dc.gov. Thank you again, and have a great day.